We begin with the story out of Washington. The Senate holding fiery and at times farcical hearings today, questioning Dr. Anthony Fauci. And he pled the Fifth, which itself is unusual for such a senior government official. He hasn't done that, of course, in the past. He's testified to many different Congresses under both parties. He did it today in protest of what he views as Republicans' unlawful demands that he be sent to jail, and a forum that he and his lawyers say is completely rigged. So why engage with it? Now, Fauci spent, of course, decades as the federal government's infectious disease expert. He was central to the COVID response we all lived through, and he drew strong reactions, ranging from at times a hero's praise to the extreme demonization on the right, which has continued for years. Now, I'm going to show you everything you need to know about this tonight. I can tell you, first of all, having lived through this, covered it, I could remember how we switched from a normal newsroom to the remote work that everyone else did in that era, and we did it while trying to put on the news every night. I can tell you that over the years, the politics of COVID have been, of course, intense, but also strange. First, Democrats led a very strong response during the pandemic. They were out front. They were pushing for action and rules and change faster than the Trump administration. And it's pretty clear that Trump's struggles to face that crisis really dragged down his losing 2020 campaign. That's where the politics started. And while many moved on, indeed, it's pretty common to say, you don't want to talk about COVID. You don't want to look at pictures from that era. You don't want to go back to that time as a human. Of course, in journalism and politics and government, not everyone should have that luxury. And so while it's understandable that personally people moved on, in the politics here, I can tell you that in the years since COVID, it is Republicans who have hammered COVID policy, sometimes on legitimate policy questions about lockdowns or vaccine mandates, but also on really more extreme plots, including villainizing once obscure agencies like the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, which is not an agency most people could name, let alone have a bunch of beef with until COVID, and also pushing outright lies and unhinged conspiracy theories, some of which are dangerous in themselves. Now, today's hearing was dominated by angry Republican theater. But I also want to report for you that pursuant to this investigation, there is new evidence and reviews of that time period that also raise really valid questions about the government response, as well as some of Fauci's own priorities. So here's what we're going to do. Tonight, we are going to report out on both of those topics. First, today's hearing, which was a newsworthy clash, which also kind of strangely vindicated President Biden's own warnings against what he worried was Republicans criminalizing the public service of Fauci and other individuals in government. And he noted that in his pardon for Fauci, which itself was an unprecedented, extraordinary act of an outgoing president. Well, today shows exactly what Biden was talking about. Second, basically in a few moments from now, I'm also going to report on the newly released writings from Fauci's diary. We're going to sift that evidence to objectively assess the record, including what in any review, journalistic, legal, or otherwise, is really important evidence when you get firsthand primary source evidence. We're going to look at that, not just say the glowing or political accounts of Fauci. Now, beginning today, Republican Senator Paul, a doctor, was hammering Dr. Fauci for the COVID response, for how Fauci and others may have approached different theories of the pandemic's origin. And then, as I mentioned, they were pushing the McCarthyite calls to jail this distinguished and elderly doctor for years on these far-fetched claims that he misled Congress. Fauci critic Laura Ingraham attended the hearing in some sort of solidarity of people who have been hammering Fauci. Republicans went after him as if at times it seemed like he was the one who caused COVID's death toll, or that they argued Fauci maybe had no concern for the victims, which is a very odd line of attack. If you all remember what we lived through, the way they talked about Fauci almost felt like a lifted projection of Trump's cold and meager response during that time.
You force people to watch their loved ones die alone over the phone. It's disgusting.
Who the do you think you were for doing that?
Loss of trust may be your most damaging legacy.
During the pandemic, you got rich, didn't you?
It is a total disgrace what you did to this country.
You got rich while people were dying, hundreds of thousands of Americans, over 1 million in the end.
You lied to hundreds of millions of people amid the worst public health crisis in a century.
COVID lockdown, however, could never have been inflicted without you aiding and abetting the crime.
This has destroyed decades of progress and lifetimes of work because you wanted to fuel your own ego and be the center of attention.
It went on and on like that. Dr. Fauci rebutted Senator Paul and saying the senator's obsessed with him. Fauci and his team argued the hearing was rigged, that it was aiming for that perjury trap I mentioned, so that he would invoke those rights, which, by the way, everyone has, the Fifth Amendment right not to incriminate yourself. Although I will note for you that is unusual for federal officials, most of whom don't invoke it and tend to testify, which he has in the past. And add to that Fauci already has federal immunity for his time in office from that Biden pardon, which was a move to preempt exactly what Republicans tried today. Now, they're trying to say that they might find new conduct legally that took place after Biden left office, which is the duration of that pardon, as some sort of hook to then get the Trump DOJ to potentially indict Fauci. Now, that sounds like quite a far-fetched bank shot and a legal abuse of power, but it's, of course, possible given how many other Republican and Trump foes are already being probed or charged under this discredited DOJ since the second term began. And so what we saw today was both the ultimate proof of why Joe Biden did what he said he did. He didn't give a bunch of, far-fetched reasons. He very clearly said at the time, because of the criminalization of public service, he was going to take that unusual step and pardon Fauci. Some criticized at the time as extreme or paranoid. Today shows it was certainly not that. And so we're really seeing a criminalization of public service that builds on that enemies list I showed you. When Trump failed to handle COVID well, many did flock to Dr. Fauci as the kind of alternative federal government leader. This Senate probe released 1,000 pages, brand new, of Fauci's records from that time, as well as his diary. And it does cast a different light on, for example, his approach to the media, embracing his star power, sometimes as the public health messenger that's part of the job, but really clearly other times it also looks like he was facing a kind of tempting personal conflict because he became fixated on aspects of his fame, even by the standards of Washington. Early in the crisis, when hundreds of thousands were sick or dying, Fauci wrote in his diary that his national and international fame was explosive and unimaginable. It is not hyperbole to say that today I am the most famous and talked about person in the country and one of the most recognizable persons in the world, he wrote in May. That claim is false. It does read like hyperbole. More Americans know and talk about Taylor Swift or LeBron James or Leonardo DiCaprio and many other people before talking about Fauci, even as he did dominate the attention of Americans who follow news or medicine and politics. Fauci wrote that his friends were saying he was a national hero, and he showed an interest in his rising star access, citing his invite from Joan Baez to the Kennedy Center. Another night, he recounted conversations with Julia Roberts, Sean Penn, Matt Damon, and a great call with Barbra Streisand, where he added, I brought the phone over to Alexa, asked to play songs by Streisand. When the song came on loud and clear, she started laughing and absolutely loved it. He noted that he would be swamped all night by people wanting to say hello and shake my hand and take pictures with me. I couldn't get away from it, he recounted at one event. There was almost a glee evidenced in the diary. Dr. Fauci at times sounding a bit more like a New York Post gossip column and rating the highest level of AAA list you could imagine in Washington at one of his events. Now, it's also true that anyone in his shoes might find that sudden shift quite dizzying. Fauci did become a cultural sensation. There was merchandise. There were shirts people wore around saying, in Fauci we trust. The New York Times had a column about, thank God the doctor's in. And it's not just Fauci's view. We should note even independent outlets like The Guardian said he did become a superstar. There were the cover stories. There was Time magazine naming him the Guardian of the Year. There was a National Geographic doc. and press was, of course, part of his job. The diary also includes him noting that Trump, quote, POTUS seems to be enamored of me, even though I'm taking the spotlight away from him. And even as we hear all these right-wing critiques, it's worth remembering Trump himself awarded Fauci a presidential commendation on his last full day in office back when the president, Donald Trump, was touting vaccines and the Warp Speed project. Now, in fairness, the diary also has all kinds of notes about work and meetings and new data and conference calls with scientists and all of the normal push and pull of life in the federal government. And we're reporting this out so you can see what the evidence shows. Lord knows if you get a diary of any politician or public figure or Trump, it would be newsworthy. I will state for the record that his pretty intense fixation on PR does not suggest any dereliction of duty on the job.